In the last episode, we were talking about all of these misconceptions that we have during capture on set, be that in Hollywood or be that as a one-man band. And we actually had a very nice discussion. We talked about chroma subsampling, sensor sizes, crop factor on cameras. We talked about a bunch of things, and if you didn't watch our last episode, I do recommend you do that. But in this episode, we're going to talk now about the post-production of things, and we're going to have one little subject just to gap that, just to put, together.
We've all tried different tools. I've used Avid, I've used Adobe, even used Sony Vegas, I'll admit it. It's sort of like I did drugs once. For every single butt that's in the seats in the theater, they really don't give a crap if we were using Avid, Final Cut Pro 10, Premiere. They really don't care.
Thomas will have lots to say about this too.
Yeah. So, I'm not gonna let him know yet. Let's capture his reaction. Well, Thomas, thank you for joining us again for part 2 of this conversation about misconceptions in production and post-production. How have you been in this past week?
It's been good. It's been a long time, but yeah, I've been good.
Oh, that's good. What about you, Gabriel?
I am very, very tired. We are prepping our house to go on the market. We're buying a new house, so all day I was doing yard work and getting jabbed and scraped and sore. So
you left your cave and went to do some real work?
Yeah, real manual labor. Real manual labor.
What is this manual labor thing you speak of?
So, Thomas, let's get your reaction. I mean, we talked about resolution, we talked about chroma subsampling, we talked about 420, 422, 4x4. But there was one thing that's still very much in use today in broadcast, which is interlaced. Not only interlaced, imagine pulling a key out of an interlaced footage, right? So that's actually something that happens a lot, for example, with virtual sets on TV and things like that. So I wanted to start a little bit with interlaced. Maybe you can explain to those who don't understand what interlaced is, and then we can take it from there.
Oh, wow. Interlaced goes back pretty far. It was actually a pretty fascinating invention at the time when it was created, and what it did is it solved a problem of sort of the frame rate of video. Back in the day, 30 wasn't quite enough frames per second, and they didn't really have the bandwidth to increase it to 60. So they came up with a way of kind of sandwiching 2 frames together into 1 frame. It's really, at the end of the day, a form of image compression is what interlaced is. And what it did is it took the space of 1 frame and it stuck 2 of them in there by alternating every other line. So the line 1 at the top was frame 1, line 2 is frame 2, and then line 3 would be frame 1 again. And you basically have 2 frames sandwiched together in the bandwidth and space of 1 frame. And when it plays back on an old school proper TV, it would display 1/2 first and then the next half. So you basically got the motion cadence of 60 frames per second, but in the bandwidth and space of 30. So it was really one of the first forms of image compression really created in the world, for squeezing more information into less space.
Yeah, absolutely. And that goes together with dropped frames as well, right?
The drop frames?
Yeah, for example, in the US, you used to use 23978 and you used to use 2997.
Those were to sort of kind of fit within those were more common in the United States. In Europe, they never had drop frames. In the United States, they had them because when they added a color, they had to shift the frequency slightly to help the color carrier within the signal. So that's why the U.S. has it. In Europe, they did it the correct way with PAL, where they didn't have to do that. So I've always considered PAL to be a superior format, even though I live in the United States. But
that's quite odd hearing that from an American, actually.
I think Thomas and I also both agree that like the metric system should be universal. We have this feet in inches, and
we're weird Americans. Yeah. We think we should have the metric system, and the reason I always considered PAL to be superior is 25 frames was closer to the film of 24 frames. So, those extra few frames in the United States didn't matter, and PAL actually had a little bit more resolution than NTSC did. So, overall, I consider it to be, from a filmmaker's perspective, actually the superior TV format. And they also didn't have fractional frame rates because they did color the correct way. And, the issue in Europe is it wasn't backwards compatible, whereas in the United States they wanted TV to be backwards compatible, so color shows could still be seen on black and white TVs, whereas in Europe you kind of had to get a whole new TV when they made that switch. That was the downside, but eventually ended up having a superior format.
One thing that I want to talk a little bit within the interlaced subject is actually the fact that, for example, Gabriel was mentioning about the jagged edges that you would get depending on the resolution and etc. to pull a key. What about interlaced, for example? Because, for example, if the subject is moving, and for example, a hand moving to the side, you're going to have, let's say, half of the hand in one frame and the other half on the other frame, and you're trying to pull a key of something that's behind it. It's behind in one frame, but on the other frame it's not behind.
By pull a key, what do you mean exactly?
To really replace the green screen with something else.
Okay. Yeah, and because of the nature of interlaced, as long as you keep it interlaced, like if you're shooting a show interlaced and the delivery is going to be interlaced, it should still work out because you're still dealing with half frames. So when it plays back, you're going to get those half frames in the correct order anyway. So even though on the computer, when you're pulling a key, you might see jagged edges, during playback, it's going to look a lot better. Now, one of the issues of interlaced is if you're shooting with a 420 format, and if you watch the previous episode, remember 420 is basically like 2x2 pixels for 1 pixel. Well, if you have interlaced where you're every other line, that no longer lines up. So they had this weird thing, 420 interlaced actually offsets that 420 a little bit, so it lines up with the different fields or with the different half frames. And so you end up having even less color information. It's still the same amount, but for each half frame, you end up having less, so the key can end up looking a little bit more jagged because of that. But for the most part, if you keep your interlaced, it should look pretty good. But for interlaced, I really highly suggest at least using 422, because the beauty of 422 is vertically you have all the pixels that you need. So if it's interlaced or progressive, it doesn't matter. You don't lose any color information.
Interlaced has been and still is a standard to this day, mainly if we're talking about up to 1080p, because in 4K we already don't have interlaced anymore, thank God, or thank whatever. But my question is, right now, we all have I think most people have sets that are 720p capable or 1080p capable, or some people are going to even have sets that are 4K capable. Not to count people that are getting their media, even if it's produced by BBC or whatever channel, on the internet. So the question that I throw out there is, isn't it time already for interlaced to die?
Yes.
Yeah, oh yeah, and it seems to me the only reason we still have interlaced is just because of the cost to overhaul that infrastructure, right? I mean, there's no real good, legitimate, artistic reason to still use interlaced.
Yeah, and it was still a bandwidth issue. Like, for example, if you were going to broadcast 1080p, 60p, it was going to require double the bandwidth that interlaced was going to require. So it was, when we had HD, it was still sort of a bandwidth of a limitation, even though the technology was there to broadcast it. It was going to mean half the amount of channels for stations. They were going to have double the bandwidth. So, at that point, it was still kind of a bandwidth consideration as well.
But isn't it kind of a way of cheating the consumer to say you're broadcasting 1080 when it's actually 1080i instead of 1080p? I mean, there is a quality difference there, right? I mean,
there is, but it is still 1080. I mean, it's, interlace is kind of an optical illusion in a way. I mean, even though we can sometimes think of it as 2 frames that are only 540 pixels high, it's actually not like that, because every line is alternating, so you have gaps in between. So you still have the detail there as if it was 1080, even though there's gaps in between the fields.
It's the spatial magic, the same way that, like, we're not really watching a movie, we're just watching temporarily one frame after another, and that creates it. So it's just like a spatial version of that.
Yeah, and because those half frames move so fast, it creates an optical illusion where in our minds we are still seeing basically 60 frames at 1080 resolution. Now, there are gaps in between, so the detail isn't quite there, but the spatial space is still there of that.
Well, only if that is watched in an interlaced monitor, right? Because if you're watching, let's say, on a computer monitor or most of the monitors today, you can actually very easily distinguish the lines. For example, if anything is moving from left to right to left on the frame, and you have what's called ghosting on the image appearing, and it can be very
crappy.
It can bother if you're watching, like if you're watching an action movie. Imagine you're watching Mission Impossible and there is Tom Cruise going from one side of the screen to the other side of the screen, and it's interlaced. And if the action is very fast from one frame to another, the position of the subject or whatever it is on the screen can vary quite a lot. So you can see a huge, instead of seeing a motion blur, instead of seeing a nice motion blur.
Well, there's a right way and a wrong way to display interlaced video on a computer display. And the wrong way is to just display it as 30 frames per second, which then you have all the interlacing lines. And in the correct way, the way TVs do it, like plasma or LCD TVs, is to actually convert the 60i to 60p. And what it does is it'll display one field on the screen, or one half frame, and then the next half frame. So what you're viewing on your TV is 60p. It's 1080p 60p, but it interpolates the in-between lines. It just duplicates them, basically, and adds in that space. But you're viewing it as 60 frames per second, as if it was shot 1080p 60p. And then you get the motion exactly the way it should look. You don't have weird interlacing lines, and so on. So that's the correct way to do it. And certain applications on a computer allow you to play back footage like that, like the VLC Player. If you play video on that, there's an option on how it deals with fields or the interlacing, and one of them is to display it as 60p. So it'll display one half of the frame, then the next half, and then so on and so on. So you actually get the proper look of that video.
Yeah, not to be confused with true motion from the TV. Never, ever switch on true motion on the TV.
No, do not do that. No, do that. Let's explain what true motion is for people that don't know.
Wow.
And why it's a bastardization of film.
I mean, true motion is like this crazy idea of TV manufacturers to make things real life, to feel like very real. So what they do is, like, for example, they make it in 240 hertz, which is basically 240 updates on the screen per second. We watch movies at 24 frames a second. And when you have the screen updating 240 times a second, it's updating 10 times faster than the actual frames that were captured for the movie. So what the TV is doing is, like, basically creating frames in between, and it creates this weird, awful effect that things, for me, it feels like that they accelerated. They're happening in real time, but it looks accelerated. I don't know I don't know how to describe that, but
it looks like a daytime soap opera.
Yeah, it does. Because what some of the fancier TVs are trying to do is for anybody familiar with optical flow and Final Cut 10. It tries to create new in-between frames. So when you have a movie that's 24 frames per second, it takes each frame 1 and frame 2 and it tries to create new in between frames to turn it into like 60 frames per second or 120 frames per second, which in theory sounds cool. It's like, oh, well, you have more frames, it's more accurate. It is more accurate motion, but then like Gabe said, it starts to look fake, like a soap opera, because we're used to seeing real video as just real life, and you sort of lose that sort of mysticism behind filmmaking when you do that, and it just makes it look artificial and cheap.
Well, there can be some visual artifacting with progressive as well, though. So progressive would be contrary to interlaced because it's a whole picture at once, but generally progressive is still scanned from top to bottom, correct? And that's why when you have a fast-moving camera, like a fast pan,
For CMOS,
yeah, you can get the like the Jello cam effect, where the whole image just kind of looks lopsided. And that's because when you pan fast, it hasn't finished scanning from the bottom, so you get this weird diagonal thing, and that's where a camera with a global shutter, right, is able to capture it truly one full image at a time.
Yeah. So what you're saying is basically that cameras, they have a rolling shutter. So the shutter starts like if you put like the shutter to 1/50th of a second or 180 degrees, the shutter, for example, is all closed, and then it's gonna open, but it's gonna open from top to bottom and closing. So you're gonna see that strip. There's actually a very good video from the slow-mo guys where they film in slow motion the shutter of a DSLR, and it shows going several different speeds. And it's a very nice explanation, and then you can imagine for video that if the camera is moving to the side and then the thing is scanning, you basically have past and future from top to bottom.
The other issue I have with TrueMotion on TVs is, just like Optical Flow and Final Cut 10, it's not perfect. You will always get rendering artifacts, and these TVs are trying to do this in real time. As you're watching it on the fly, and as we know, many of us know, trying to do that kind of slow motion, even on a pretty powerful iMac Pro, requires rendering, and you have to wait for it to happen. So, when you factor in that these TVs have very tiny processors compared to our beefy computers, and they're trying to do this sort of optical flow, recreating the frames in between, there's no way it's ever going to be accurate, and you get weird artifacts and blockiness and blotchiness, and it's not a good way to do it, and movies were shot at a certain frame rate for a reason, and that's one of those things you probably shouldn't mess with.
Yeah, and these TVs, they will actually end up dropping the resolution in order to be able to keep up with what they're trying to do.
Yeah.
I used to have a TV like that. When an explosion would happen in a movie, the resolution would drop to a point that it was unwatchable, and I had to return the TV. But in that subject of hardware, Gabe, I think you wanted to talk a little bit of Mac versus PC. So look at what we're getting.
This sort of debate has been going on for so long. Since the first Mac came out. So many people talk about, or I want to say, but they don't say it, they scream it, that this Macs cost so much more money and they're such a waste of money and only a fool would buy a Mac when you could just build your own PC for way cheaper. There's a lot that goes into that. And I think today in 2018, that cost difference has never been closer, really. Thomas and I talk about this a lot, so I'm going to let him take the floor on this. And let's first talk about like off the shelf, and then we can get into the build your own, because that's where it starts to get crazy, where people say, I can just build my own. But that whole process automatically is, you can't really compare that. So you're comparing a build your own PC to an off the shelf Mac, because there are no build your own Macs really. There's a Hackintosh, but. So let's start with off the shelf.
We're not going to go there.
Yeah, plus later on I also want to mention one part of considering that is like, see it if you would be a company with thousands and thousands of computers. A lot of people say, oh, they all use Windows, and for the majority of the time that's the case. But I want to comment about a couple of companies that have changed that and the reasoning behind, and there's data to support that. So, Thomas, it's all yours.
Oh, okay. All right. So, how should we start this? Like, on which point?
I would say, I would say the one thing that a lot of people mindlessly only think about is the cost that is how much it costs for them in their wallet in the moment they are purchasing the computer.
Sure. Okay. Well, it is true. That a lot of times you can buy, a Dell computer, an HP computer, or some pre-built PC computer, and it probably will be cheaper than a Mac. It kind of depends though on the specifications, but typically if you're gonna walk into a Best Buy right now, which is a store we have in the U.S. to buy computers and all sorts of fun toys, and you look at a desktop computer that's sitting there, and then you look at an iMac, for example, which would be the Apple sort of equivalent of a desktop there. And you're probably going to pay a little bit more for the iMac, but there's a few things to take into consideration with that, and it's not always just about the hardware specs. If you're comparing the CPU and the graphics card and a couple of other things and saying, well, this computer's $500 cheaper, but it's got a better graphics card, sure, that might be true, but if you're chasing specs, you're always going to be chasing specs. And the first factor that I found, and other people are actually starting to find, and there have been a couple of recent videos on YouTube that kind of explore this as well. Max Urov recently did one where he compared this really monster PC that beat the daylights out of an iMac. In like Geekbench scores, as well as on paper, but then when you actually run the type of applications you run on Windows versus running Final Cut Pro 10 on the iMac, and the iMac completely smoked the PC. And this is something many of us have found as well as Final Cut Pro 10 users, and obviously we don't want this to turn into a Final Cut Pro 10 is awesome and better than everything else kind of thing. But there's a thing in software development, and I'm a software developer as well, so, but efficiency is very important in software development. And kind of the direction Apple has taken for a while now is, let's make the software and the hardware work well together. Let's make it more efficient, to the point where you don't need hardware that requires fans that sound like a jet engine to be able to get your tasks done in Final Cut Pro 10. And I'm still using a 2012 iMac, and I can edit 4K video from my GH4. I know Gabe was using a 2013 iMac for the longest time.
I still have a studio upstairs where we're cutting multicam 4K from a Sony FS7 and a GH4, sometimes a GH5, native, no proxy, no problem, no hiccups, at best quality.
And that's a 5-year-old machine now. Mm-hmm. Try doing that with a PC with Adobe Premiere. And this is not meant to pick on Adobe Premiere. Adobe Premiere has some great features to it. I've used Adobe for many years. I still use a lot of it at my job, and I have nothing against it, but Adobe tends to take a brute force approach to their software development. They're like, what, graphics cards are getting faster, processors are getting faster, we're just going to keep kind of going down this path where people have to buy these beefy machines, and they'll get the job done. And that's true. If you build a 8-core PC, Premiere's going to scream. It's going to be pretty awesome. But the point is with Final Cut Pro 10, you can get that same level of performance that 6 or 8 core PC desktop has with a quad-core MacBook Pro,
and continue to have that same level of performance for years.
For many years. So getting back to that sort of that initial investment in the computer, there's these people that are like, well, I'll save $500. But
okay, I'm gonna interrupt you right there because I was going to take back to the first initial investment, because that's how because you already got into the software part, and those things do differentiate PCs and off-the-shelf stuff from Macs. But there's another thing that differentiates too. If you're looking at an iMac and a competitor desktop, let's say that the specs are basically the same, and you're paying more for the iMac, look at the iMac and look at the desktop that you're getting. There are a couple of things that go into do this here. There's the R&D and the design and the materials that you're using here. There is the quality of the display that comes together with it. There is the fact that they are not using incredibly huge fans that are going to keep everyone awake in your house. For example, I live in a one-bedroom house like a studio. If I had a PC, I would have to switch off every night to go to sleep because I have very light sleep. But the iMac is extremely silent during the night. So all of those hardware things that make the iMac a little bit more expensive or the MacBook Pro a little bit more expensive, be that $200, $300, $400, they are taken in consideration right here. It comes with a wireless keyboard. It comes with a wireless mouse or a trackpad. The speakers are pretty decent. The screen of the 5K iMac, I mean, seriously, you build a PC and put a 5K screen, it's going to cost you. And nowadays,
that display on the iMac, I'm really glad you brought that up because people are saying, well, I can buy a 4K monitor for a lot cheaper. Well, sure you can.
Not accurate.
But the iMac is not only a 5K monitor; it has P3 color, which is a huge price point for a monitor. And it's a 10-bit monitor as well. So if you went and looked for a PC 5K monitor with that level of resolution, and has P3 color, which means it has very accurate color, especially for film producers, and it has 10-bit color as well, and all of a sudden you're looking at a PC monitor that's $1,200-$1,300, and that iMac is no longer overly priced. I mean, it's true you can build a PC, getting back to that whole custom build thing, that has a beefier graphics card. And if you're running Premiere, again, that's probably a good thing if you can do that. But the iMac is not holding any of us back at all. The graphics card that's in there, the processor that's in there. I mean, like Gabe said, he's doing productions daily on a 2013 iMac. I'm doing stuff on a 2012 iMac. Gabe has a new 2017 iMac that just screams. You had iMac Pro before that, and you returned it and got the iMac instead because certain things are faster on it. And it's a killer machine for productivity, and that's what's important with Apple is productivity.
It's getting your work done, and something people rarely, if ever, mention when they're comparing these systems is the actual user experience, the experience of using the system.
Mac
and
OS,
that is, you're basically Mac OS or Windows. That's basically it. And for me, the experience of using Windows was pretty painful when I had to do that at my last job, which happens to be where I met Thomas.
Although Windows 10 nowadays, it is a lot better than it has ever been.
Yeah. Windows is not bad. You can be very productive on Windows as well.
Well, speaking of color, though, Mac OS also has ColorSync. And ColorSync syncs the colors automatically behind the scenes between all your apps. So if you're going from Motion to Final Cut, there's no color transition. Whereas with the Adobe Suite, you've got to kind of set it up within each app and go through Adobe Bridge to use that as your. And it just.
What about audio, for example? Audio on Macs have been extremely professional since macOS 10. Anyone that's going to be dealing with professional audio, actually not everyone, because you can plug in an external device, but for example, the way the Mac deals with external devices and all of those things is actually completely different than Windows has ever done. It's so easy to route audio within macOS, even simple audio routes. For example, you immediately can change which microphone or speakers you're using on your Mac, just a couple of clicks. And on Windows, you're like, oh, God, where did it go?
And getting back to that user experience thing that Gabe brought up, that's important to a lot of people. I always hear online, Apple's no longer professional. They're not professional. They don't cater to the professionals anymore. And it's like, well, what the hell does that mean? It's like we're all professionals and we use it. I mean, are we sometimes misinformed or clueless or no longer professionals? Are we amateurs because we prefer to use Apple? And it's like, no, there are different perspectives of what it means to cater to a professional. There are some people, the PC people, that think it's, well, give me the best specs, the fastest specs you can possibly give me. I'm like, okay, sure. And there are companies that do that. And then there's the Apple approach where it's like, you know what? Our professionals, they don't want to fart around with computers all the time. They don't want to fix and maintain their computer. They don't want to have to worry about upgrading their computer every year or every 2 years. We want to give them something that can make them productive. And these are people that work with some sort of a craft. And they want to hone their craft and work with their craft and not deal with all the technical garbage all the time. The fact that we can sit down at our desks or sit on a plane, with our MacBook Pros and get work done and not have to worry about anything really. We don't have to really worry about viruses. We don't have to worry about upgrades. We don't have to worry about, well, my graphics card is slightly slower, so I'm not going to be able to get anything done. That's not true. Final Cut Pro 10 can do a lot with modest graphics cards.
Have you ever tried to connect a printer for the first time on a Mac and then also try to do that on a PC?
That's an excellent example. That's the clearest example of user experience that you can give. It's a printer.
Yeah, being professional to a lot of people is don't let the technology or the tools get in my way. They should assist me and not be a hindrance. And that's kind of the whole point of user experience design. And in my current job where I develop mobile applications, I'm also a user experience designer. And that's incredibly important, because we don't always just design our applications to look cool or provide all these awesome capabilities. It's also about making them user friendly and easy for people to use, because that's at the end of the day is more important. And there's a reason why software development has been going in that direction lately, of making tools simpler to use. Don't let them get in the way. You don't want something to be super complex all the time. You want, if you're an artist, you want to just sit down, do your shit, and get out.
And what is one of the most professional parts that I think that there is in hardware is support. Something that a lot of people forget. If you build your own PC, I'm sorry, you're not going to get support from one specific company to fix your problems. If you build your own PC, you got the graphics card from ATI or from NVIDIA, but you bought at Best Buy. So good luck there, and get there for every other component in your computer. Now, if you bought your computer from Dell, yes, you're probably going to get support from Dell, but have you seen the ratings from the support for Dell or HP? And have you seen the ratings for the support from Apple? Even Gabe, that had the problem with the iMac Pro, and it was quite frustrating. Can you imagine going through that with HP or Dell, for example?
Yeah, I had significant issues with 2 different iMacs, and it was they were not able to fix the problem because it was hardware related, and it's such a new product. But they did solve the issue for me. I got every penny back. I got this computer set up. So, Apple, the experience of working with Apple was very pleasant. It was just, wanting to have this $9,000 computer I bought work for me. That didn't work out. And we talked about productivity. I was losing hours not having a functioning machine. At the end of the day, I needed to get work done. So I was like, forget trying to fix this. Just take it back. Just give me a new, high-end 2017 or 18 iMac, 5K iMac, and it's been great. And every iMac I've ever bought has been great since the very first iMac ever released.
And the other thing is, if you're a big post house, or if you're big or you're small, it doesn't matter. Let's say that you have a workflow set and you use that workflow every day. Let's say that you're Hollywood, for example. If something breaks, like a computer, you want to be able to replace that as fast as possible. And the easiest way is with an Apple computer, because guess what? That computer that you have is very easy to go there and buy exactly the same computer again, or a newer version of that, and you're going to have pretty much the same. No, because...
Depending. For example, this is a spec'd out Mac, so you can't just pick it up at the Apple store. You've got to order it online. But
Sure, yeah. You might not have the availability immediately. You might have to wait for 2 days, but it's very different from, I get the case from this Cooler Master, and I got the CPU from, it's the i7 specific number, and then this NVIDIA card, and then suddenly that dies, and you don't have time to troubleshoot, or maybe you're not the technical person and you just need a replacement. And it's going to be very difficult to get the replacement for that custom computer. If it's a custom Mac, there's just so many ways you can customize a Mac, and it's quite simple in a lot of ways. And if you're a big post house, you probably have a professional services agreement with Apple. So all of those things, which has also the same with HP and Dell, all of them offer professional services. You actually pay yearly. I don't know how it works with Apple, but you pay yearly for Dell or HP. There is tier bronze, silver, and gold, and platinum of support with these companies. But yeah, those things do count on the price of the computer, and it's not that price that you're gonna pay to the store when you're buying. So those things you have to take in consideration.
So we've talked about the hardware.
We're passionate about this, huh?
It's important. I mean, especially like the user experience thing. I spend more time every day, more hours, staring at my user interface than I do most human beings throughout the course of the day or my week. So I need that experience to be as painless and as enjoyable as possible. And so that's worth a lot to me. And for me, that's Mac OS. If somebody prefers Windows, this is a preference. There's no right or wrong or good or bad value you can assign to that. But this is what I prefer, and it's worth a lot to me. And if the box that OS comes in costs a little more, that's worth every penny to me.
Yep, it's the same reason why some people buy a BMW versus a Kia. You know, they both get you from A to B. You know, they both perform very well, but you know, some people just prefer to do it in style.
Yes.
You can put style together. Like, for example, a Prius also gets you from A to B, and it saves the earth in a lot of ways. And if you want style, you can go with a Tesla. Just saying.
Yeah, I was just gonna say that, you know, like, you know, people think, you know, PCs are cheaper because you can upgrade them. Okay, you know, initially you may pay $500 less for a PC that you custom built, but then you factor 1 year later you want to add a new graphics card. That's $500 right there for a top of the line graphics card. Yeah. You know, you want to up your storage speed. You know, there's another couple $100. So really, after a year or two, your custom built PC is now at the exact same price point as the Mac, and our Mac is still going strong. We never had to crack that thing open at all.
And most of the things that drive you to need an upgrade is software, right? And if you go back to what you're saying about software and performance, then we are again like, oh, you need to put more RAM because the program that you're needing that you're using needs more RAM. But then you get Final Cut, for example, and use it on a 8 gigabyte MacBook from 2016, because that's exactly the computer I had, and you can edit 4K, one by one, original media. So it's.
I mean, I'm using a 6-year-old iMac. Gabe still has a 5-year-old iMac, and they're still going strong. You know, if that was a PC, we would have had to upgrade that thing at least once or twice to keep it going. And there's a certain point where you can't upgrade anymore. Like processors, they depend on a socket type. Yeah. And in the PC world, you know, you only have maybe one generation you can kind of move up, you know, for a processor before it changes a socket type. Then you got to replace the motherboard, or what we call logic board in the Apple world. You know, and then, you know, sure, the graphics cards, they've been kind of using the same PCI Express slot for a long time, so you can always upgrade that.
Well, but the memory,
not everything, but the memory, that kind of changes as well. You know, we went from DDR to DDR3, and then, you know, they're moving up to DDR4 and 5 RAM at some point. You know, it's, you know, eventually you can't upgrade those computers. And I know, because I used to build, you know, edit systems for companies in the past, and you know, you can only upgrade those things to a certain point, to the point where you get to where you end up ripping out all the guts anyway, and then it's practically a brand new computer. And so that whole upgrading concept, it's sort of a myth in a way. I mean, it's a placebo effect. It makes people feel good, like they're in control of their own fate. But the reality is you hit a glass ceiling pretty quickly.
The only time I've ever seen a computer being built right in front of me was Thomas building a PC at the production job we had when we met. And I thought simultaneously, this is really cool. It's really cool that you can do this. And it's the kind of shit I don't ever want to spend time doing myself. I want to be editing, I want to be cutting or grading or whatever. I don't want to be messing around with these components.
No, and it's kind of a nightmare. I mean, the amount of research you have to do to make sure the socket types line up, or if you get a graphics card, you have the right pin types for the power connectors. You know, it's all this crap you have to worry about. It's a pain in the butt. And yeah, you know, sometimes you'll order parts, you wait your 2-3 days for it to arrive, and you get it and you're like, crap, that's not really going to work. And then you got to return it and get the next one. And you know, and you got to have a lot of experience and know-how to not goof up when you build it and get the right stuff. And it's way too much effort versus going on to Apple's website and being like, yeah, give me the top-of-line iMac. You know, 2 days later, you got your machine, you're up and running, you're cutting your feature film, and boom, you're done.
You know, building PCs is all I did for the first 5 years of my professional career. That's all I did. It was building PCs and fixing old PCs from people. And then you see that's where you go at in terms of support. You end up depending on people instead of companies to do the support. Now, I love that. And Gabe, one of the things that we needed to do, for example, to troubleshoot, let's say a computer is not switching on, and then you know that there are 3 things that you need in order for a computer to switch on, or 4. You need the power supply, obviously. You need the motherboard. You need a graphics card, and you need memory, or in the processor. Those are the very bare minimum that to have. But one of the first things that you troubleshoot is the power supply, because the power supply is like the cheapest of them all, like generally speaking. And one way to troubleshoot was to get a paper clip and couple 2 contacts of the power supply, and then if the fan would spin, you're like, okay, the power supply is still working. Now imagine that you're like, oh, go to someone's house and then open the computer, pull the wires out and say, do you have a paper clip? And the person, no. Do you have one of those little wires that you use to tie bread, like the bag of the bread? And they're like, yeah, I have one of those. And then you bring it and remove with your teeth, and then like, okay. And she's like, what you doing? No, I'm just seeing if it's still working.
You know, it's just not worth the hassle anymore.
It's not worth. And once I got the Mac for the first time, I was like, yeah, I love building PCs and having exactly what I want, exactly the processor I want, exactly the graphics card I want. But once I got a Mac, it went past just the specs, the processor and etc. that was there, and I delve into the user experience. And for me, experience trumps everything else.
Yeah, absolutely.
I don't know if it's coincidence, but I find it interesting that you were building PCs, but as soon as you got your Mac, you weren't building anymore. You were using it to be creative.
Yep.
It's kind of interesting.
That's exactly how it happened.
And that's kind of the whole point we were making. You know, you get all that junk out of the way, and we're all artists, so we just want to do what we want to do.
All right. Everywhere you look, you will find people saying that Final Cut Pro 10 is not a professional tool, that it's a joke, that it's for amateurs, and this is 7 years after its release. I find this absurd and ridiculous. I don't find it maddening anymore because, I mean, I'm in probably 7 different Facebook groups for professional Final Cut Pro 10 editors. I've met people who are editing content way beyond what I do now, all using Final Cut Pro 10, from feature films to high-end documentaries. It's clearly a professional tool, on par at least with every other NLE out there. Why do people, I mean, and I mentioned this in another episode, these tools aren't professional. It's the person who used the tool that's professional. You can use whatever you want.
Yeah.
But Felipe, you've got something on your...
Yeah, one, the vocal people that say that are a minority. Always. That always happens. Whoever is very satisfied with something, they don't have time to go into forums and praise. You only go into forums or the internet to complain. And everyone else that is using and is being successful, they're worried about the stuff that they're doing. They have stuff to do. So they are not there on the internet saying, oh, another great day on Final Cut. Yes, you're not going to see that. Really, you won't. The other thing is, it's a fact that people do not like changes.
No.
And even if it's for the better, they just don't. And there's the other thing is there is regional opinion. Because I was on a Twitter conversation with someone, and Michael Cummins, he shared a poll, which NLE you're using at the editor's retreat. And there were about maybe 50 people that answered or something like that. And then someone was like, oh, it's very interesting to see what editors are using. And I said, well, that's a very small, extremely small portion of editors, first of all, in a very narrow segment of the industry. And if you would want to see that as a real example of what people are using, the data set would need to be 5 to 10 million people.
Yes.
Because that's the very least amount of people that are out there creating content and editing every day. Just to start. And then the second is, the most vocal groups that we see on internet are, I'm sorry guys, Americans.
Sure.
Americans spreading fake news? Oh my goodness.
There is a history of, I'm sorry, so many people are going to be pissed at me. But there is a history of not wanting to learn, finding learning difficult, finding learning a hassle, and finding change difficult. If anyone that wants to evolve and progress, you need to change. There is no way to evolve without change. And you can't do that without education. Those things are super basic. And education means if tomorrow suddenly there is a way of making what I'm doing half the time that I'm doing with the same quality, I'm all in.
Yeah.
And I will learn at least to see what I can do. And I'm trying to learn every day. I read, the content that I read and that I watch is all education based. So when someone talks that something is not professional, I would say if you don't have the time or the will or the desire to change, evolve, and learn, I would say I don't need to even spend any time of my day listening to you. Those people that support education, learning, progress, innovation, those I want to hear them. I want to hear what they're saying.
And when I say that the people who say it's not a professional tool, many of them are people who've never even opened Final Cut Pro. But I do want to kind of put them off to the side and say that there are plenty of people who have given Final Cut Pro a fair shot and still prefer something else, and that's different. Because you can still have your preference. I mean, I don't like using Premiere because for me it's a user experience problem. I don't like so many panels, and I just don't like the way its methodology. I don't like the way it works. But that's a preference thing. That's not an efficiency thing per se. So if you want to use Avid or Premiere or DaVinci, like, go for it. That's awesome. You know, I'm also very curious about Resolve, for example.
Absolutely.
To me, if I wanted to go back to editing with tracks, it would be Resolve for sure, no question. It just happens that I've been using Final Cut for 7 years, and I have no interest in going back to tracks. If I had to close my doors and go work for another company being an editor, I would then, assuming they're not using Final Cut, I would edit with tracks. That's fine. I mean, at the end of the day, I want to edit, and if it's tracks, it's fine. I'll deal with it. It just won't be as fun for me, and I know this because I had to edit on tracks before I had Final Cut, and a few times since I've had to drop in and go back to Final Cut 7 here and there or Premiere, and it's just it's not the same thing. But these are preferences. These are people who use these tools and are informed by them, not people who are just coming in from the outside saying, this thing sucks. Like just parrots chirping what they've heard before.
It's absolutely ridiculous for people to have that position because like you said, Gabe, we've all tried different tools. I've used Avid, I've used Adobe, even used Sony Vegas, I'll admit it. It's sort of like I did drugs once, but I've used all these tools, and never once have I ever said, these tools aren't professional enough. And to say those kind of words, it's really a form of software discrimination. Anyway, it's no different than ageism or sexism. When you say things like that, or this tool's not professional, even when you haven't used them, honestly, it's a form of discrimination. And it's ridiculous because there's no such thing as a tool not being professional enough. I mean, sure, you could say maybe iMovie isn't, but to call,
if it gets
tool,
the work done.
Yeah, it gets the work done. And you know what? If Spielberg cracked open iMovie, I'm sure he would make an award-winning film with it. It really doesn't matter because it comes down to the artist. And sure, there are certain limitations and certain tools, but you know, it's really upsetting when people say that, and it really just comes from a highly emotionally charged input, either out of fear of change, like was mentioned, or jealousy of the fact that they don't have a Mac, so they can't use it. You know, and that's also part of that whole Macs suck because they're overly priced kind of argument. It all comes from the same place.
In Brazil and India, that's the case. Macs are so expensive because of local taxes that it doesn't give people the opportunity to use Final Cut, for example. So of course, it's understandable. They're also pirating the other software.
Yeah, and so people are just naturally going to hate it because they can never use it. You know, it's why people hate certain things, because they can never use it. It was like, well, that sucks. Why would anybody want to use that? I can't do that.
I know why someone wouldn't use Final Cut even if they like it. Because they're paid per hour. So if you're paid per hour,
what?
And it takes you 12 hours to do something on Premiere, and those 12 hours, you're considering renders, you're considering a lot of other things that if you're an editor, if you're a Premiere editor, you do know that. And I think we all had the experience here. Now, you would get paid for 12 hours. Now, if you go on Final Cut and suddenly you're finishing 3 or 4 hours, you're getting paid only for 3 or 4 hours for the same exact thing. And then you're like, oh no, I'm not going to use Final Cut because I'm going to lose money right there.
Well, or you could make up the difference and spend the next 8 hours refining and polishing and actually putting in your due diligence to make a better video.
Or adding more creativity.
That's a different type of editor, right? That's a different type of professional.
Yes.
Both of them are professionals. But they're professionals and professionals.
Or you just raise your hourly rate because you're more efficient to make up the difference. I mean, it's, or you don't charge by the hour, charge by the project. And there are many different ways to skin that cat. Piggybacking on Final Cut Pro 10 is not a professional tool is this idea that Hollywood only uses Avid. To which the first thing I think is, so what?
Yeah, why should I care about Hollywood, to be honest?
Well, on our 2 episodes ago, we had Bradley Olson on, and he raised a really good point in that Hollywood gives people something to aspire to. I mean, I'd be lying if I didn't say Hollywood's been inspiring me since I was for as long as I can remember, and that's the whole reason I wanted to get into movies, is because I want to make movies. My dream wasn't just to have an online show, because when I grew up, the online didn't exist. There was no internet.
And it's part of the reason why we eventually wanted to move to 24p and more shallow depth of field and things like that. These are all concepts we picked up from Hollywood, so it's natural that we want to aspire to Hollywood as some sort of example.
And let me expand that out. I don't just mean Hollywood, because, like, for example, today we're also in, like, what I would consider the golden age of television, where these productions are just amazing. And that's not produced in Hollywood. And there are amazing films all over the world being produced at that level. So I guess Hollywood is an unfair label for what I'm talking about. I just mean,
it's kind of a generic label to talk about the film industry.
You're talking about the high end. You're talking about the upper high end tier of production, right?
The creme de la creme of, like, creativity and money.
Okay, my answer to that would be aim or aspire to an ideal. So, for example, aspire for what it is that they're delivering. For example, see Game of Thrones. Wow, it's a beautifully told story, and so on. Get any other TV show that you love or a movie. What we shouldn't aspire to is which screw are they using on that tripod that's connecting the legs to the head, or any crazy things like this. I mean,
or which brand of bread is the caterer using on set.
Yeah, I mean, those are not the things that we should be concentrating on. And, of course, Hollywood and broadcast, they have the tendency, because of the investment that they already made, is to not change anything. If it's working, why should we change? Let's continue doing that way. And if you're not there yet, you shouldn't aspire to that. You should aspire to something better, more efficient. That's going to get you to the same place. So I think...
Well, it's just like you said at the beginning of the episode, where Interlaced isn't still this huge standard still because it's the best. It's there because it's just what everybody uses because that's where the infrastructure is. And I would argue that's the main reason Avid is still being used in Hollywood is because they just have so much invested in that infrastructure.
Yeah.
It's not because it's technically the best tool. And there are people, for example, the couple features that have been edited with Final Cut 10, those filmmakers were very interested in trying a new approach, and they ended up saving money and having a great experience with it overall. Now, that doesn't mean there weren't challenges. I mean, there are challenges in every movie, but the very fact that 2 people at least did it, more if you count documentaries, means that anybody could do it. And likewise, people are, the Coen brothers are editing with Premiere, and they're doing it as well. So.
Okay, I'm gonna say this. There are 2 feature films coming out in Brazil in the next month or so. There are a lot of countries out there that are using big productions, Final Cut. We just don't know about it. We don't hear it because we are part of this very closed, small group of people that are the vocals on the internet. And the ones that are producing the stuff, they don't have time to be talking about it. And we are not exploring other countries. There are more than 200 countries in the world. There are a lot of very high-end productions.
I thought it was just America.
America.
I was going to say something funny about geography and Americans and trying to point at countries in the map, but you can find that on YouTube.
We are painfully aware of,
Yeah.
We know.
Kind of another point, and I brought this up recently online because there was a discussion about anamorphic versus spherical lenses and so on, and and my whole position was, at the end of the day, does the consumer even know what the hell we're talking about?
No.
Or do they understand?
They do not.
For every single butt that's in the seats in the theater, they really don't give a crap if we're using Avid, Final Cut Pro 10, Premiere. They really don't care. If the story sucks, it sucks. If it's awesome, and it's going to make money. And that whole Avid thing, like Gabe said, it's because there's a lot of money invested in it. That software costs a fortune. Some of the hardware-based Avid systems, they cost a fortune. They're invested in it, and Hollywood's a slow-moving steamship. And they're not going to just change overnight. And it's not just the software and the hardware, but it's the talent. You train editors for decades how to use a certain platform. They're going to stick with it because why not?
You need to be able to call somebody in and know that they can jump into your Avid and just take over.
And they know how to do it. And
it's a very valid reason.
Yeah, and it's also a habit. Hollywood is a creature of habit. They do things they're used to. Because why rock the boat if you don't have to? They've got endless piles of cash to throw at these productions. They don't give a crap if it costs $100,000 for a couple Avid seats.
A very, very good way of comparing Hollywood and editors in general with a different industry is banking. Banking, yes. In the United States, you have the same problem with banking. Yes, bank money.
It's not that kind of show, Gabe.
Yes. Not spanking.
I'm open to all kinds of ideas, Thomas.
That's my cue to leave.
Banking, dealing with money is something that we've been doing it for a long time. And banks, you have a lot of banks in the United States. We have a lot of banks all around the world. But it takes a long time to send money to someone if they just have a different bank. Sometimes even with the same bank, it takes some time. And there is a revolution going on in terms of banking. Not only banks are making things faster or they're changing their fees or they're changing the infrastructure, but then you have blockchain. And blockchain is something that is revolutionizing banking in general because now they are losing control. Now suddenly they are not the center of the world, the financial world. And it's the same thing with Hollywood. We used to always compare everything to Hollywood. Oh, this is not good enough because Hollywood doesn't use. Oh, this is not good enough because TV stations don't use. And it's not about that anymore. It's not good anymore because it doesn't perform as well. It doesn't save you money, or it costs too much, or the support, and so on. So I think this is the way I would think. As a business owner, I have to think about how much it costs me to do something and what I can get in return for what I'm doing as a business owner. And will I have Premiere on my business? No, it doesn't make financial sense for me because of how much it costs me to operate on Premiere, how much time it takes me to get things done. Also, it doesn't make sense for me that a bunch of other things. And will I use Avid? Well, the answer is pretty much the same. Can I use DaVinci? Yeah, it's actually quite likely that I could use DaVinci. But then goes back to the thing of, we've been using tracks for a long time, and then suddenly Apple said, oh, there is a different way that you can deal with digital media, and it's not with tracks. And then we discovered that that's actually quite efficient. Now, do I want to go back to tracks? No.
No.
Do I want to go away from what Final Cut is doing? Yes, if it's better. Yeah. So,
Sure. Yes.
Yeah. If somebody comes up with a better concept, sure. I mean, we're not just tied to Apple because it's Apple, or Final Cut because it's Final Cut. We use it because it's going back to that whole hardware thing and efficiency again. Final Cut Pro 10 is efficient. We can do things not necessarily faster just because we want to get it done quicker, but it opens up more creativity and allows us to do more things and focus more on certain aspects of our craft instead of all this weird technical mumbo jumbo, just like building a computer. We don't want to fart around with that stuff. I don't want to fart around with all this stuff in Premiere or Avid.
None of us has Final Cut Pro 10 editor on our business cards. It just says editor. Well,
Yes.
Thomas, you used to. But we don't define ourselves professionally by the tool that we use.
And we never should.
But with our clients, that is. Because I could say Final Cut 10 to a client, and a client has no idea. This is in the context of a show where we're talking to, I would imagine, other shooters and editors. And I mean, we're not talking to like seamstresses and blacksmiths. So it's relevant there. Don't define yourself by the tool, but be passionate about it, sure.
Absolutely. I don't call up a carpenter and the first thing I ask him is, do you use Craftsman brand tools? I mean, I really don't give a crap what tools he uses if he can get the job done. And it's the same thing with what we do. Can you do the work?
there you go. Can you do the work? I think that's a good way of ending this subject, I guess.
I guess we could have just started with that and saved ourselves like 20
It's could have been a lot shorter.
Can you get it done?
Okay, so thank you, Thomas, for taking the time to do 2 episodes in 2 weeks with us. This was
Absolutely.
very nice of you. We definitely enjoyed it. It was a very nice conversation. Although I'm very sick, you can hear my nasal sound here. Gabriel, thank you again for putting all of this content together. It was amazing. Guys, any last remarks?
Thank you so much for having me here. I love doing this. I mean, while I don't spend as much time with video as I used to, it's still something that's probably my #1 passion in the world, besides my family. I love this stuff. I spend a lot of my time online, studying and discussing with people and kind of helping people on forums, with either software or video concepts or hardware concepts and so on. So it's pretty much what I do, is just love discussing and sharing information in this field as much as I can. So thank you again for having me here. I love it. I'll be glad to be back anytime.
No, this is it. End of the road for Thomas.
You are done with me.
Yeah, you lost me at spanking. I thought for sure that's where we were going to go, and you cut that off.
Well, guys, if you liked this video, please click on like, subscribe to our channel. If you're listening to this in audio form, take a look at our YouTube channel, our Facebook page. It really helps us if you're giving a like there, if you're subscribing, because we do want to grow this channel. And we have several other guests that are coming up in the next episode, so watch out for that. We have very interesting people that we're going to be talking to.